Winter 1858, Massachusetts. Gaslight smoke drifts along Beacon Hill, clinging to brick like a bad memory. Down the slope toward the wharves, salt air sharpens the cold. Behind the iron fence at 28 Mount Vernon Street, the Witcom mansion is a husk, roof gone, windows blown to mouths of black. In the cellar, bricks sweat, and silence is louder than the wind. A week after the fire, a municipal clerk, nervous, deliberate, signs for a sealed packet from the city coroner. In blue pencil across the wrapper, Witcom, bodies buried within the foundation. The packet is logged into existence and then, as if in the same breath, vanishes from the city record. Only its shadow remains, a docket number, a receipt stub, and much later, a woman in a reading room turning a page and feeling the breath leave her. Because in a mislabeled folder at the Massachusetts Historical Society, wedged between shipping manifests and sermons, someone filed what looks like a domestic accounting ledger. Its paper is thick, salted with flour dust, edges sinned as if it slept too close to flame. The hand is a clerk's hand, neat to the point of cruelty. Entries run in 2 columns. On the left, names of dockhands, laborers, a sailmaker, a man noted simply, nephew of Mrs. F. On the right, small currencies, larger sums, and a repeating phrase written in careful legalese that hurts the eyes for its gentility. Services of Vitality. December 3, 1852. T. Flynn, $10 upon execution of agreement, $30 upon fulfillment. January 7, 1853. R. O'Neill, $5 stipend, $25 upon proof of cessation. April 1853. J. W. 2 sovereigns, left no signature. See Mr. P.'s note. And there are the other papers, the letters no one meant to read again. A widow's handwriting, thin and elegant. The line must not fail. Send only sober young men, discreet, and of robust constitution. A lawyer's reply, Madam, our language must be general to avoid scandal. The phrase I propose is vital services pursuant to private arrangement. Your daughters must be secluded. Respectfully, J.P. Another slip unsigned, not meant for eyes at all. Keep the side gate latched. No carriages, twilight only. In 1852, Eleanor Whitcombe was already a city in one person proper, severe and rich. Witcom and Greeley, her late husband's firm, had made a fortune from whaling ships and China trade. Men bowed when her carriage passed. Ministers thanked her for donations. After Mr. Witcom died in 1851 without a son, Boston's newspapers called her the city's most fortunate widow. In back rooms, the talk was more practical. Her estate had been drawn tightly, a knot intended to keep property within the family. Issue. A clever knot. One that required heirs of her blood. Boston in the 1850s was a city with a layered face. Above the hill, marriage columns, soirees, grammar lectures, Brahmins discussing metaphysics by a coal fire. Below, down toward the docks, tobacco spit freezing in alleys, men bent under loads, Irish voices rising from boarding houses, cholera shivering through back rooms. The Fugitive Slave Act had just made Southern slavery Boston's unwelcome guest. The first whispers of nativist rage, the no, nothing movement, thickened the air, and in medical journals men argued about the womb as if it were a distant country they had no maps for. Eleanor Whitcombe did not wait for the world to provide maps. The letters, the ones in the MHS box, show a woman who thought in contracts and managed in shadows. She had 3 daughters of marriageable age, none yet wed. She had money, and a problem no polite parlor would admit, an estate whose trust bent toward blood. On a scrap of paper, in a script that does not falter, she writes, "We shall take our measures quietly." The first document that bears the phrase, Services of Vitality, reads like a service contract and a confession at once. It provides compensation to the man or men to furnish said services, insists on no claim, demand, or expectation of association with any issue resulting therefrom, and threatens legal consequence for talk. Witnesses sign with X, sometimes in a careful hand not their own. The men named are not bankers. They are dockhands, stevedores, a groom from a livery stable, the younger brother of a shop girl. They come at twilight, via the side gate. They leave by the same. No one in the letters uses the word sex. That, perhaps, is the mark of their era. There are euphemisms so gentle they barely cut. Vitality. Fulfillment. Proof of cessation. If you squint, If you let the words wash over you like a hymn, you could miss what they are meant to do. Neighbors would later say the Witcom girls disappeared into a winter of headaches. Curtains stayed drawn. The eldest, people whispered, took the air, only at dusk, veiled. The second, suddenly stout, vanished to a house in Roxbury, where a midwife known to the dockside kept no books anyone could subpoena. In a ledger at Mount Auburn, the cemetery of Boston's good families, there are burials listed as infant, Witcom, unnamed. There are also blank weeks and a spring with nothing recorded at all. On the night the mansion burned in 1858, a storm pushed in off the harbor. The warden wrote, "Faulty flu," and moved on. The coroner wrote something else, slid it in a packet, and dropped it into the city's throat. Bodies buried within the foundation. The phrase is terrible because of what it might mean. Infants, men, or no bodies at all, only rumor, poured like concrete to set a story hard. This is what the papers suggest. This is what the papers refuse to say. We know a ledger exists, found much later, misfiled. Its ink a soft brown that stains your fingers if you linger. We know a coroner's note was written logged, and then unlogged. We know money moved, quietly, precisely, between Beacon Hill and the wharves, and we know a house burned, taking with it a great many polite lies. But why did this happen? And why was it erased from history? Before we continue, if this story intrigues you, subscribe and ring the bell, so you never miss our deep dives into America's darkest historical mysteries, and tell us what city or state you're listening from. We love hearing from our community of history enthusiasts. Wind the clock back to 1840s Boston, granite and brick rising, ships crowding Long Wharf, gaslight untangling fog. Witcom and Greeley owned 3 vessels outright and had stakes in 7 more. While oil paid for parlors, tea paid for colleges, and names like Witcom paid for entry into rooms, where men pronounced on the destiny of the nation. Eleanor married into that world as a Whitman daughter from Cambridgeport. Respectable, educated, a taste for Latin verse she would later deny. By all accounts, she ran a splendid house, gave to churches, and kept the kind of guest list that made columnists swoon. Her husband, Charles Witcom, was outwardly abstemious, inwardly anxious. His letters to his partner Greeley read like inventories of fear. "No, son," he writes in July 1849, "no probable son. We must secure the line." His lawyer drafts a trust done in the old style, careful with the language. Issue of the body. There is a clause a modern reader might skim if no issue, property to revert to collateral male relatives. Cousins, widowers, uncles. Names that circulate like freight slips. When cholera arrived in 1849, it took one of the Witcoms as servants and nearly took Eleanor. A doctor's journal, held in Harvard's Countway Library, notes, Mrs. W. pale, nervy, given to sleeplessness. He prescribes laudanum and walking. The Boston Medical and Surgical Journal around that time is stuffed with theories about female derangements, a polite phrase for the century's deep ignorance of women's health. There is talk of tonics, of compresses, of bleedings. There are a few whispered experiments in Paris and London, done in private, about artificial aid in procreation. They remain whispers. When Charles dies in 1851 of a fall aboard ship, struck by a swinging spar in a storm, Eleanor becomes half a family and twice a force. She reads her husband's will and sees the trap it has built. Her daughters are to be provided for, of course, but the bulk is a river flowing straight through them to whatever issue of the body appears. Without grandchildren, preferably male, the river shifts its bed. Probate will become a feast for cousins she has never liked. Everything they built would go, in the language of Chancery, to next of kin. Eleanor's letters from this period, saved by someone who thought paper is a kind of immortality, are clipped but not cold. To her lawyer, "Show me the ways." To her minister, "Do not question my intention." To herself in a margin, "If the world were fair, I'd inherit as a man." The respectable surface holds. The girls appear at the Athenaeum, at a charity concert for seamen's widows. Eleanor funds a school in Roxbury and sits on a Bible Society board. The wharf rumors, if they exist yet, keep to the waterline. Only in a few places do we see the darkness begin to seep. A maid, dismissed and bitter, gives an affidavit that mentions the side gate. A midwife's ledger, still in private hands, lists W, followed by a dash and the word twilight. A sailor writes to his brother in Charlestown. There's a lady on the hill pays for the strong work. I'll say no more. The first contract is written in an unremarkable room on Milk Street, above a law office that smells of ink and damp wool. The lawyer, initials J.P., is attentive to words. He has drawn up bills of lading for years. Here he draws something stranger with steady hands. Between Mrs. E.W., acting for the benefit of her household, and hire blank, a laboring man of sound mind and constitution. The blanks will be filled with a stevedore's name, a groom's, a cooper's, always men at the margins of gentlemen's dinners. The phrase, services of vitality, appears in the third paragraph, introduced as if it were normal. The consideration, money, appears in the fourth, $5 to $10 upon signing a month's boarding house rent. Further sums, upon fulfillment. There is a clause, ugly, practical, that no claim shall be made by said male to any child which may issue, nor shall any approach be made to the household except as directed. 2 witnesses will sign, the lawyer himself, and a man whose name appears more than once as facilitator, Mr. L., a dock foreman. In the ledger, a note by his name, reliable. It is twilight when the first man arrives at Mount Vernon Street. A maid who later tells her story to a neighbor describes how the side gate creaked, as if it disliked the business. He is shown to a small parlor behind the pantry, papered in pale roses, where a decanter sits with nothing stronger than water. He waits. Someone, never the lady of the house, brings a sheet of paper, a pen, a small leather purse. He signs an X and is told to come again at the same hour next week. Who decided the men? The ledger suggests a preference. Irish names recur, as if Eleanor, or the lawyer, sought robust anonymity in a despised class. If that choice was strategic, it carries a double edge. The city already suspects the immigrants, already thinks them capable of any vice. Their voices will carry less weight if they talk. Their bodies will be easier to forget if things go wrong. Upstairs, a daughter paces. Downstairs, the contracts make ash of romance. This is the part the letters do not say but cannot avoid. There are midwives in this city who know how to keep counsel. There are back stairways designed to keep the front parlor from ever becoming aware of what keeps it warm. In January, the ledger shows cessation, next to an initial and a sum of $25. In March, another. By summer, there are fewer entries with bonuses, more with the small stipends and nothing else. If you read numbers as breath, the household is holding its breath. By late 1853, whispers have found their teeth. Beacon Hill is a neighborhood of eyes behind lace. A dressmaker speaks too loudly at a pump. The second girl hasn't been seen. A coachman in a stable on Joy Street says an old midwife has been to the house 3 times in a fortnight. Over grog on a wharf, a dockhand brags with the defiance of the poor. Best money I ever made for nothing but my trouble. A clubman writes in his diary that Mrs. W. declines invitations on account of feminine complaints in the household. At the Athenaeum, a librarian notes a borrowed volume on hereditary traits, returned without a signature. In a boarding house ledger in the North End, the proprietress writes, Rory O., paid up through March. New shoes, pockets full and no work. The ledger at Mount Auburn Cemetery records 2 small burials in 1854, both Witcom infant, 1 marked, 1 not. The minister's note beside the unmarked, private, for charity's sake. The lawyer who drafted the agreements pushes for distance. A letter in the MTS bundle reads, Madam, I must insist on boundaries. These transactions court ruin. Perhaps it is time to alter your will. Eleanor replies with a slab of stone in ink. The will is the problem. The line must not fail. The Lord judges the heart. Her minister, more human, writes, there are other ways. She underlines other, and leaves the page. There is a midwife, Irish, Catholic, who peels potatoes at her kitchen table and says nothing. But her daughter, years later, tells a WPA interviewer about the fine ladies who come after dark. Their faces veiled with the same gravity you give to the dead. They never stayed to tea, she says. They never smiled. And the men? The ledger makes them into amounts and initials. Between the lines you can feel the outlines of fear, a man who stops coming and sends his brother instead, a man who writes, "No more, leave me be." A note from Mr. L. The foreman, Tommy Flynn, came back for his bonus, says the lady owes him. He spoke loud in the alley. We must quiet him. The next entry by Flynn's name is an X, nothing else. If an arrangement is to be kept so quiet it ceases to be a sin in the eyes of those who benefit, it must be tight as a drum. Rumor knows where to press. The night of the fire tastes of iron. A nor'easter has come down the harbor, gnawing shutters, bending gas lamps to blue. The Witcom girls are said to be in the back of the house, a maid knitting on a stool between their doors. Eleanor is in a front parlor writing. The wind makes the window sash tremble. Downstairs, by the kitchen stair, there is a smell. A bloom of smoke sweet as a lie. At 12:17 a.m. box 52 is pulled. Fireman Hall pumps up the hill. Neighbors in nightshirts pass buckets, their breath making clouds. Inside, a flue, faulty, the warden will say, has sent a finger of flame into the space between wall and soul. Flames find polished wood with the appetite of a debt collector. Mirrors crack with heat. Curtains go at once, a sacrifice made of silk. Someone screams, someone else does not. The house empties badly. A maid shoves a girl through a door. A chair skids and becomes a thing that blocks. A portrait falls and makes a sound you might remember all your life. Eleanor is seen briefly at an upstairs window, hair unpinned, mouth open but no sound. She disappears, and in the street someone says her name as if it were a prayer and a curse at once. By dawn the flames are embers and decisions. The warden stamps, accidental. The insurance man arrives, looks at the ruin, and finds arithmetic. The coroner, Dr. A.C., a neat man with a bad hat, steps carefully over joists, looks into black spaces that used to be rooms. He goes down to the basement where the house's bones are. There is a place where the floor above has fallen into a hollow, where ash lies thick, where bricks glow dimly with their own fatigue. His memo, if you believe the stub left at City Hall, is brief. Bodies buried within the foundation. A phrase like a blow. The packet with that memorandum is signed out by a clerk, initialed, and never filed. People who sort papers for a living will tell you that things walk if you make them, and sometimes if you don't. The Boston Daily Advertiser prints 2 inches. Destructive fire on Mount Vernon Street. No loss of life reported at this time. What a liar. If there were bodies, whose bodies were they? If there were none, who wrote the phrase, and why? If there were, and they were small, Boston is not innocent. If there were and they were not, then this story has a different ending altogether, with a shovel and a quiet agreement in the cold. The paper trail is a maze with bad light. Into that dimness, investigators, historians, and later gossips have carried their candles, each convinced they see the thing as it is. The result a handful of plausible versions, none comfortable. Theory 1, the scheme of blood. This trope is the one the ledger supports most directly. A widow, bound by a trust to produce grandchildren of her body, orchestrates a clandestine program to achieve what a husband could not. In this reading, Eleanor is both villain and victim. Her letters, while never explicit about the acts themselves, make policy. The line must not fail, she writes. The lawyer's euphemisms cannot conceal intent. The compensation scheme, small upon contract, larger upon cessation, speaks the language of a 19th century understanding of fertility and married cycles without naming them. This version, supported by the correspondence and by payments in the ledger, is not about romance or even sex. It is about property manifesting as pressure upon women's bodies. Then the fire. In this theory, the coroner's line, bodies within the foundation, points to infants, perhaps stillborn, perhaps unwanted, perhaps the grim result of a policy carried to its unseen conclusion. Construction practices then sometimes tolerated burials on private land, but beneath foundations in Beacon Hill. This would be scandal. The disappearance of the coroner's report becomes comprehensible as a mercy, or a cover-up purchased with insurance and influence. The city, wary of destroying a name that underwrites its learned societies, loses the paper. Coercion and complicity. Here, the contracts were not only distasteful, They were exploitative to a degree that verges on criminal. Were the daughters consenting? The record does not say. The phrase, "for the benefit of her household," is cold. A maid's later remark about crying behind the door becomes heavy. In this view, Eleanor uses class and law to overrule her daughter's autonomy, buying men and time and the silence of service. The coroner's phrase indicates inhumane disposal. The fire is accident. The destruction of records is not mercy, itself protection by the city's elite. Extortion and violence. Men paid to do a job understand they have a secret that someone very rich would rather keep. If a few returned to the side gate not to render service, but to demand more money, if voices rose, if a scuffle ended bloodily, what then? The phrase, "bodies buried within the foundation," could be read as a euphemism for corpses hidden during a renovation. The house had work done in 1856. A bill in the MHS folder shows repair of cellar walls. This theory darkens further in the telling a foreman loyal to his employer, a corner of a cellar at night, bricks and quicklime. The fire that follows 2 years later is convenient. It erases whatever could be found, and the remaining record, that coroner's memo, disappears because the living always look after their own. The smear. Boston's nativist press loved a story that soiled an Irish name and a Brahmin at once. Services of vitality could have been a lawyer's dry term for something else. Employment, care work, even hush money unrelated to reproduction. The ledger's euphemisms invite projection. Perhaps the coroner's phrase was misread, miscopied, or forged by a later researcher hoping to sell a book. The Massachusetts Historical Society staff who catalogued the box in the 1970s wrote, "Provenance uncertain." Beside the ledger, that uncertainty is a crack gossips can wedge a story into. In this reading, the fire was accidental, the coroner's packet routine. Charred remains of household pets were occasionally buried under floors, and the disappearance of the report nothing but bureaucratic attrition. The scandal is folklore, sharpened to injure a widow who did not deserve it. Theory 5. The law did it. The more chilling explanation is also the most banal. Inheritance law built a situation in which any woman in Eleanor's position would feel cornered. Issue of the body is not romantic. It is tax code with skin. If a courthouse draws a river, so only one bridge leads to safety. Don't be surprised when people crowd that bridge, shoving. Eleanor didn't invent the trap. She used the tools she had: money, privacy. A lawyer willing to split hairs so fine you could use them to sue a seam. The coroner's line is factual, but unrelated to the scheme. Household servants, trapped in the fire, were interred temporarily while family negotiated funerals. The report disappeared because the next century decided such details were impolite. This theory asks us to look not only at one woman's decisions, but at a city's architecture of power. Who investigated? Officially, few. The fire warden closed his report with accidental. The insurance company turned risk into numbers and paid. Dr. A.C., the coroner, wrote something that made a clerk's hand shake, then lost it. A police captain recorded a rumor about a body arrangement and was told by a superior to destroy the note. In the 1930s, a historian at a small college wrote an unpublished paper titled Beacon Hill, A Study in Respectability, citing an elderly midwife and a law clerk who saw more than ink. In the 1970s, a young archivist shelved the ledger, hand trembling not with fear, but with the knowledge that handling the dead is a kind of intimacy. Today, we read what's left and know that certainty is a luxury the past refuses to sell us. The records called it misfortune. The locals whispered something else entirely. After 1858, the Witcom name thins. The firm merges with a competitor and quietly drops the W. A cousin from Salem administers what's left. The house at 28 Mount Vernon is rebuilt with a smaller footprint, its cellar filled and paved. Families move in and out, children skate on the common. An old woman feeds sparrows and never gives her name. In city directories, Eleanor W. appears for 2 more years at a lodging house on Beacon Street, then surrenders her place to silence. One daughter is rumored to have gone to Europe for her health. Another marries in Hartford under a different name. The third, if she lived, lives low. Archivists, a particular breed of monk, keep this sort of afterlife. They note that in 1860 a trust paid a Miss E an annuity through a bank in Paris. They note that in 1863 an L. Wit bought a ticket to Liverpool. They note, with a small flare of indignation, that in the 1890s a reformer speaking at a ladies' club on Beacon Hill denounced the abuses of lineage, only to be politely not invited again. As for the ledger it slept, the Massachusetts Historical Society is a crucible for exactly this sort of sleep. Boxes of family paper arrive with a lawyer's smile and a donor's stipulation, available to scholars after my death. Decades later, a graduate student asks for ship's manifests and is handed, by a board clerk, a bundle labeled, Miss Bide Sermons, Witcom Shipping. Inside the ledger, the contracts, a letter where, the line must not fail, reads like a threat. That student writes a thesis with careful footnotes. A professor tells them to cut the sensational bits, and still the pages whisper. The phrase, bodies buried within the foundation, lingers because it is literal and metaphor at once. Boston is a city built on buried things, marshland filled, wharves extended, graves moved when they become inconvenient. Foundations are not just where we put weight. They are where we hide what make the weight buckle. If there were bodies beneath the Witcom house, they stand in for other bodies we refuse to name, the laborers who died moving stone, the infants whose births went unregistered because their class made them invisible, the daughters whose names are recorded only in the taking of breath. 50 years after Eleanor's letters, America embraced eugenics, cloaking old anxieties about lineage in new, shiny words. Good stock, women were told, with kindness or force, to reproduce or not reproduce as the state required. Seen in that later light, the Witcom effort to strengthen her bloodline reads not as a monstrous aberration, but as a private preview of a public mania. The difference? Eleanor's scheme was illegal only in the court of the polite, but later generations wrote their schemes into law. It is tempting to decide, to say clearly what she did, and why and how it ended. But perhaps the truer lesson is the H that sits at the center of these papers, how money insists on making bodies into instruments, how law, written by men for men, makes women solve puzzles their makers never had to face, how class picks who gets to experiment with consequences and who has to live them. The other lesson is about archives. The past is not a museum where all the glass is clean. It is a basement where things move. A coroner's report can disappear when it threatens to make an accusation that would throw a stone at a glass house. A ledger can survive a fire because someone put it in the wrong folder. The stories that survive are not always the ones that deserve to. Sometimes, the only clue left is a phrase that lands like a hammer on stone. Perhaps the truth still lies hidden in a donor's sealed box, in a church ledger that reads, anonymous, in an attic trunk where a woman kept a letter she never showed anyone. Perhaps it sits in that lost coroner's file, waiting in some city office misfiled as paving invoices, the word bodies, asleep in blue pencil. Or perhaps the only truth that matters is the way this story makes the air feel thin when you read it, as if the house were still burning and you were deciding which papers to carry out. We are left standing in the cold on Mount Vernon Street, watching a house that no longer exists and reading papers that barely do, a ledger that turns men into initials and women into contracts, a phrase, services of vitality, that tries to make private what should never have been policy, and a coroner's line, bodies buried within the foundation, that makes an allegation without giving us the mercy of certainty. So where do you land? Which theory feels truest to the bones of this story? Was this a calculated, desperate attempt by a widow trapped by inheritance law? A private eugenics before eugenics had a name? Was it coercion masquerading as duty? Daughters turned into instruments for the sake of a line? Did dockside extortion turn the cellar into a quiet crime scene? Or is this entire narrative, the ledger, the phrase, an elaborate smear or a misunderstanding baked into the archive by time and wishful malice? Tell us in the comments, which theory makes the most sense to you? And what detail disturbed you the most? The side gate at twilight, the cold arithmetic of the contracts, Or that one line about bodies beneath a house meant to symbolize good family. We read every reply. If this episode gripped you, show some love with a like and subscribe with notifications on so you never miss our deep dives into America's strangest buried scandals. Share this with someone who loves Boston history or who thinks they know it. And let us know where you're listening from. Our community of history sleuths reaches from Beacon Hill to the back roads, and hearing from you helps us find the next mystery. In our next episode, we'll pry open another sealed story, a rural almshouse that entered new arrivals as numbers, not names, where a ledger line reading, transferred to the river, recurs too often for comfort, and the only witness left is a porcelain tag dredged from the mud on a spring morning. You won't want to miss